right, class, we're out in the woods, and I just heard some predators. So let's put on our camouflage, and let's try to survive. Today's lesson is about anti-predator behavior and how animals avoid being hunted. So let's get into it. So life in the wild is dangerous. For almost every animal, there is something out there that wants to eat it. And this constant threat of predation has shaped an incredible diversity of behaviors in the animal kingdom. We call these anti-predator behaviors, or the ways that animals try to avoid being eaten. Sometimes these mean avoiding detection altogether. Think of the gecko in the previous slide blending in with the leaves, or a gazelle staying perfectly still in the tall grass. Other times it's about surviving after you've already been spotted, like a squid releasing ink or a rabbit zigzagging to escape from a fox. But these defenses aren't free. Camouflage might make you harder to spot, but it also means it's a lot harder for mates to be able to find you. Running away saves your life, but it costs a lot of energy. So animals are constantly balancing the costs and benefits of different defensive strategies. What's fascinating is that this creates what biologists call an evolutionary arms race. As prey evolved to become better at avoiding predators, predators evolved to become better hunters. And so the cycle continues. Faster cheetahs, more agile gazelles, stealthier owls, and more sharper-eared mice. Now in this unit, we'll explore the many strategies that animals use to survive this arms race, from camouflage and mimicry to alarm calls, group defense, and even a little bit of deception. The first line of defense for prey is to avoid detection. Think of this as sort of the stealth phase of survival, hence the camouflage hat, the strategies that keep prey from being noticed in the first place. Because if a predator can't find you, it can eat you. Now here are some common strategies to avoid detection. For example, we have things like camouflage or crypsis, we have burrowing, feigning death, maybe even mimicry or using or exploiting a biological rhythm, right? So animals that are prey will often hunt at night in order to avoid predators that hunt during the day, and then also things like hiding in a group. So let's go ahead and dive into this first stage first. Now, when we think of an animal blending in, we usually imagine camouflage, right? Stripes, spots, colors that match leaves, right? But Crypsis is a lot more broad than that. It's about avoiding detection entirely, no matter how the predator is quote unquote seeing you. Now, most people think Crypsis is visual, and yes, that is a big part of it, right? Think of a leaf insect that looks like a piece of foliage, or like a snowshoe hare whose white coat really perfectly matches the white snow around it. But so yeah, these animals use things like color, shape, and texture to disappear, but animals also hide in other ways through like chemical and electrical signals. For example, some insects and amphibians will mask their scent, reducing the chance of being sniffed out by predators. Certain fish, like electrical rays, can suppress or alter the electrical signals so that the electroreceptive predators, like sharks, can't really detect them. One of my favorite examples actually comes from something that's much less glamorous, and that is the giant swallowtail caterpillar that looks exactly like bird poop. And so predators like birds that would normally eat caterpillars will simply see this caterpillar on the leaf and be like, oh, that's poop. Nobody wants to eat poop, and they'll leave it be, right? And so Crypsis isn't really just about being invisible, but it's really about sort of being unremarkable. You don't need to vanish completely, but you just need to be able to not stand out. And so in the natural world, something that looks boring can really often be the best survival strategy. Now, of course, lots of animals have odd coloration, though, and just because it seems that an animal is blending in with their environment does not mean that it's actually why they look that way. So how do we know if an animal is using Crypsis? Well, we can actually test for this in an experiment. And so in the next couple slides, I'm going to walk you through how to design an experiment to test for Crypsis. And so if you really want to join in, I think this would be very beneficial, but go ahead and take a pen and paper out and try to work along with me as I describe the different parts of the experiment, and maybe sort of even try to anticipate what I'm going to do next. Okay, so one day you're walking along the beach and you notice that there are two types of crabs around. You have the solid colored crabs and the spotted crabs. Because you are in my class, you immediately become interested in whether the spotted crabs are spotted because they blend in with their environment. So how might we test this? Go ahead and brainstorm some ideas, take a little bit of a pause. Feel free to pause the video if you need some more time, but write down, sort of your main question and how you might decide to test this in this crab species. Well, let's start with the first main question that we need to answer. Does their patterning increase the survival by reducing their predation? Now, obviously, both variations of the crab exist in the population. We have solid crabs and we have spotted crabs. So they're both surviving, which means they both have some sort of adaptive value, right? If evolution favored one variation over the other, then we would really only see one crab variation. So we're not testing generally how each crab survives, but rather whether the patterning helps them in different environments. The beach provides a great place to think about this. If you try to remember back to the last time you were at the beach, what two environments might you hypothesize that each crab would be good at surviving in? Go ahead and think about that for a second and pause the video if you need some more time. So if anyone has been to the beach recently, they know that sometimes it can look like this with a bunch of shells, and sometimes it can look like this where there's not really a lot of shells and it's just a lot of sand. I think it would be reasonable to predict that the solid crabs might do better in one environment and the spotted crabs might do better in another. So based on this, what would you predict? Go ahead and take a second, write down your predictions for what you think both variations of crabs would do in both of these environments. Once again, if you need some more time, go ahead and pause the video and we're going to go over my prediction and how we are going to test it. I predict that the solid crabs will survive better on sand backgrounds and the spotted crabs will survive better on shell backgrounds. So now the question is, how do we test this? Go ahead, once again, we have our prediction, so go ahead and take a second, write down what you would test and how you would test it. You can get as creative as you want, and then go ahead and pause your video if you need more time, but we're going to go ahead and go over the experiment that I would run. So if I were to test this, I would set up two enclosures on the beach. One that is consisting of only sand and one that is consisting of only shells. Then I would put two types of crabs in each enclosure and then let it sit out for a couple days and then come back and measure how many of each type of crab survived in each of the two arenas. So let's take a look at the results. On the y-axis, we have the percentage of crabs that survived, and on the x-axis, we broke it down into the solid and the spotted crabs. Now let's look at the shell enclosure first. All right, so this is for the enclosure that only had shells, and wow, do we really see there is already a difference. The spotted crabs survived more in the shell environment than the solid crabs did. But what about the other environments? Let's look at sort of the sand environment. Well, would you look at that? All right, so the solid crabs did better in the sand environment. But before we make any conclusions, we can still run another test just to be sure that it's the spots that are actually causing them to be hidden from predators. And so if you can think of another condition, go ahead and pause the video if you want to. Think of another condition that we could run to really, really hone in and test whether it's the spots that are causing the crabs to be blending in with their environment. So what if we wanted to make sure that it wasn't something to do with, say, genetics or behavior? How might we account for this? Well, good thing the crabs are easy to paint. So we can actually take the smooth, solid crabs and paint them with spots and then rerun the experiment. So we'll go ahead and look. This is basically take the solid crab and go ahead and paint it with spots. And go ahead and take a second and think about the following two scenarios. So if the spots are providing camouflage from predators, how do you think that these painted crabs would survive in the shell enclosure? And then how do you think that they would survive in the sand enclosure? All right, so that's scenario number one. Scenario number two is if it's not the spots and maybe it's something like the genetics of the crab or maybe the crab's behavior, then what would we expect for the painted crabs to do? So go ahead and think about that scenario and write down what you think would happen there. All right, so go ahead and pause if you need some more time, but if the spots are providing camouflage, then we would expect them to survive more in the shell enclosure than in the sand enclosure. However, if the spots are not what's causing them to survive better, then we would expect them to survive more in the sand enclosure because they are indeed solid crabs, they've just been painted, than in the shell enclosure. And so let's go ahead and pretend we ran this experiment, and then this is what we get. So what does this say about the spots on the crabs? Well, it tells us that the spots do appear to be providing some sort of camouflage from predators, right? When we took those solid crabs and we painted them with gray spots, they survived better in the shell enclosure than they did in the sand enclosure. And so this really highlights that it's the spots that are providing a level of crypsis in this very specific environmental context, right? And it also kind of highlights how we can begin to test how an animal might look the way it does and why it looks the way it does, and really demonstrate that it's there to blend in with the environment. All right, so far we've talked about passive camouflage, which is when animals rely on sort of their fixed appearance to stay hidden, but some species take camouflage to an entirely different level, and they can actually actively change the way that they look in real time. So for example, octopuses and cuttlefish are masters of this. Their skin is packed with these specialized cells called chromatophores, and they can sort of expand and contract to change color and pattern within a matter of seconds, right? If you look at this GIF down here, you can see it's really blending in with its environment like almost instantaneously. And so basically beneath those other specialized cells, there are layers and layers that reflect and scatter light to sort of fine tune their appearance with their background. So when a cuttlefish glides over sort of a patch of sand, it doesn't just sort of blend in, it actually really becomes the sand. And then when it moves over to new coral, it will sort of instantly transform again to sort of hide that their appearance against the coral. And so this is known as behavioral camouflage or active camouflage. And it's not just looking hidden, but it's actually sort of deciding to hide moment by moment, whereas sort of the passive camouflage is just sort of a fixed trait. All right, so another way to hide from predators is to simply be quiet. In nature, silence can literally save a prey item's life. Many animals rely on things and basically known as acoustic camouflage, right? So this would be avoiding or suppressing sounds that could give away your position. Now, a great example actually comes from moths. So some species of moths can actually hear the ultrasonic clicks of bats, and then when they detect those sounds, they will immediately stop flying and basically plummet out of the air by folding their wings up and sort of becoming like completely still. Now to the bat, they basically just disappear. They vanish on their radar because they're no longer making any sort of noise. Now, the cost, of course, of this is that you then are plummeting to the ground, and that sort of interferes with the moth's other goals of finding food, attracting mates, and so on. But it's a lot better than sort of getting eaten by a bat. So when they detect these sounds, they will often sort of become silent and sort of drop out of the air. There's actually even some other moths that have developed a sort of a countermeasure where they will make sounds back to the bat and sort of confuse the bat. And right, there's this really beautiful evolutionary arms race between a bat and a moth, and different species of moths and different species of bats to sort of avoid being eaten and to also then sort of try and find those moths. And I don't have time to talk about it in this lecture, but if you're really interested, there's a lot of really, really cool work on sort of that evolutionary arms race. So far we've seen how animals can hide by blending in or going silent, but some species actually do the opposite. They don't hide at all. Instead, they pretend to be something else. This is known as mimicry. Now, an evolutionary strategy of mimicry is actually one that is built on deception. It's not about disappearing, but it's rather about tricking sort of the predator's visual system or their brain or another system. One of the best known forms of mimicry is known as Batesian mimicry. And this is basically when a harmless species will sort of imitate or mimic the warning signs of a harmful, poisonous, venomous, or toxic species. The mimic, the harmless mimic species really gains protection because predators have learned to avoid anything with these sort of warning patterns, right? So for example, the king snake is a classically highlights this, right? It's completely harmless. You see it here on the right side of the screen. It's non-venomous, but its red, yellow, and black banding really closely resembles that of a venomous coral snake. And so predators that have had a bad encounter with a coral snake will quickly learn to stay away from anything that looks remotely similar to the coral snake, and in which case the king snake looks really, really similar. And so mimicry, like this one, really only works when their dangerous species is common enough to elicit a fear response from a predator. And so basically, if mimicry becomes too common, it really starts to sort of break down and sort of the illusion collapses. So that's sort of an important part of mimicry that you need to keep in mind. If the mimics are way more common than the dangerous original species, then the predators really won't learn that well. All right. So, all right. So these were all ways of animals avoiding being detected. But looks like we've been spotted. So our camouflage didn't work. Our silence didn't work. Our mimicry didn't work. And instead, we have an animal that's coming right towards us. So what in the world do we do? Well, animals have a couple options. So once an animal's detected, the game changes completely. The goal really isn't to stay hidden anymore, but it's really to survive the encounter. And animals have evolved an incredible set of strategies for doing that. Some simply run. They run these sort of fast, erratic, unpredictable movements to sort of get out of reach. Others will freeze and play dead, tricking sort of predators into thinking that they're not really worth the effort, right? A lot of predators don't like consuming dead things. They only like to consume living things that they've killed. Some fight back with claws, with venom, with chemical warfare. Some use startle displays like bright colors or loud noises. And so there's sort of a wide gambit of strategies that prey can use once they've been spotted in order to sort of defend themselves against a predator. And so let's go ahead and look at some of these strategies in more depth. The most intuitive response to danger is to run, right? Fleeing is the go-to option for most animals once they've been spotted. The goal here is simple. Put as much distance as possible between you and the predator, right? If you and I were in the woods and we saw that puma come around the corner, we're going to start running, and hopefully you're faster than I am so you can avoid being eaten. But anyways, but there's more to fleeing than just running fast, right? So many prey species move in these sort of unpredictable zigzag patterns. They're trying to sort of dart away, and this unpredictability can really make it hard for a predator to anticipate where they're going to go and how to chase them, right? Everyone here, I'm assuming, has played tag at some point in their life, right? And you know that if you just run straight, the animal or the person who's faster than you is going to catch you. But if you can kind of zigzag and turn and jump over things, right, you're more likely to get away and not be tagged. And so there's actually a framework called the optimal escape theory. And it really predicts that animals should flee only when the risk is high enough to justify doing so, right? Because if you flee too early, then you might waste energy or lose feeding time, right? But if you flee too late, well, then you've become lunch, right? And so that's why sometimes you'll see videos of the African safari, right? And you'll see these animals, and they're clearly see the lion or the hyena nearby, but they're not moving, right? They're in a group, and so that's another factor that plays a role. Is like, right, maybe they feel protected in the group. And you also see the lions and the hyenas. They're not going to necessarily approach unless they feel like they can actually get the prey. And so there's this balance of what is being optimized in those situations. But yeah, so if you've ever seen this video and you go, why in the world are they not moving and there's a lion right there? Well, sometimes it doesn't make sense to do so, right? You got to optimize your behavior because running comes at a cost. All right, so sometimes the best way to survive isn't to run, it's actually to stop moving entirely. Some animals will play dead in hopes of tricking the predator into thinking that they're not really worth eating. Many predators, especially those that prefer fresh or moving prey, will quickly lose interest in something that looks dead. Now, one striking example of this, everyone knows opossums will feign death, but one example of this, which I find very funny, are the feigning death beetles. You may have seen these in sort of deserts, and they also actually make a common pet. But basically, when you disturb them, they literally tip over on their backs, their legs like stiffen in the air, and they look for very, very convincing. They look dead for a couple minutes. And so, like I said, opossums will do the same thing, and possums take it actually a step further. They'll actually drool. They'll actually kind of exude like sort of a foul-smelling odor, and they'll be completely limp, right? So if an animal grabs them, they kind of just like flop over. And so it's really realistic, and oftentimes predators will just leave them alone. Now, of course, once again, as with foraging, as with any of these behaviors, there is a trade-off. If the predator isn't fooled, well, you're going to be lunch because you're now a very, very easy target. But also the prey then loses a lot of precious time that they could be using to escape or to engage in other behaviors like feeding or social behavior. So sometimes survival means doing nothing, but sometimes it means playing dead and trying to hope that the predator that's trying to get you believes the act. Now, obviously, if you and I were in the woods and we found a puma, I would start running. If you decided you weren't faster than me and you decided to play dead, well, you probably become lunch and I'm going to get out of there. So it really depends on the situation, but certain species have evolved of this ability to sort of feign death. Now, another similarly related strategy is known as autotomy, and this is when an animal will voluntarily drop or shed a body part, usually to distract or deter the predator. A classic example of this is a lizard's tail. I'm sure everybody has encountered this at some point in their life where a lizard drops their tail. So basically, if a predator tries to grab them, the lizard will contract this special muscle that severs the tail at a very, very weak joint. But really, really interesting, the tail will actually keep twitching and kind of wriggling back and forth like you see in this GIF. And that is done so that it helps draw the predator's attention while the lizard sort of makes its getaway, right? Some crabs will do the same thing with their claws, and even certain insects will shed legs after being trapped. And ultimately, these animals will drop these limbs because they can regenerate them later, and so they're non-essential to their life. And so they would rather come at a cost, right? And that cost is having to regrow the appendage. But in some cases, you would rather have a lack of a tail or a lack of a claw and survive than to keep those items and get eaten, right? And so a missing appendage can really make it harder to court females, and it really does come at a cost, but it's a lot better than losing your life. So far, we've discussed animals that rely on things like hiding, fleeing, trickery, and maybe even some mimicry. But others will actually fight back with force. They'll use weapons or armor or chemistry in order to defend themselves against a predator. Think of like the porcupine as a classic example, right? The reason they have those spines is to protect themselves from being eaten by a predator, right? And the same thing happens with elephants and water buffaloes, right? They will actually physically attack a predator to hopefully defend themselves and their group, or maybe their young. Now, some species will actually do something even more remarkable, and they will produce toxins or irritants, turning their bodies into actual chemical weapons. And then lastly, there's another strategy in social species that will use basically the power of numbers to group up together and then to come together to mob, harass, or even attack a predator. And so now in the next part of this lesson, we're going to really dive in to those different strategies. Now, some of these defense mechanisms are physical, but many prey species have developed chemical defense systems. Here's an example of a squid that is releasing ink when it is feeling threatened. When an animal uses secretions to deter, confuse, or distract a predator, then it's considered a chemical defense. Now, many animals have evolved these abilities, and if you think about it, they make a lot of sense, right? Predators are typically bigger and stronger than the prey, so a physical defense may not always be the best strategy. However, no matter how strong a predator is, it can't outmuscle chemical warfare. And these chemical defenses are diverse. Some cephalopods will use ink, skunks will spray a pungent odor, and some amphibians will actually excrete a toxin out of their skin once they have been put into a predator's mouth that will cause sort of a foul taste or even a poison that causes the predator to drop them. But one animal that truly takes chemical warfare to the next level is known as the bombardier beetle. And so bombardier beetles use chemical defense as a weapon to defend themselves against predators such as swarming ants, spiders, or maybe some amphibians like toads or frogs. And basically, these beetles will blast potential predators with a very highly volatile, caustic, noxious spray. And basically, this acid spray will it's a chemical reaction that happens that sprays at the predator and literally can burn or cook the predator alive. And so the way it does this is it has two different chemicals in two different compartments, and then when it feels threatened to shoot that, it will combine those chemicals, form a chemical reaction, and then spray that chemical out into or at the predator. And oftentimes it is a very deadly attack. You can see here in the video, it actually does kill the ants that are trying to attack it. So there's a really awesome video by BBC on YouTube. I'll link it in the description if you want to take a look at it, but they do a really good job talking about chemical warfare in bombardier beetles. Now, other times animals use teamwork to defend themselves against predators. Many social animals specifically will engage in a behavior called mobbing. This is where multiple individuals will band together to harass or drive away a predator. You've probably seen it in birds a lot of times, like crows or smaller crows or mockingbirds will swarm or mob a larger bird of prey, like a hawk. Right, and that's basically to get the hawk to get away from their territory, to get away and not prey on these smaller birds. But other animals do it too. So primates, mobbing is quite common in primates. For instance, vervet monkeys or baboons will collectively like scream and throw objects and like lunge at snakes or even larger prey items like leopards in order to sort of protect their group. So even if the predator is much stronger, the risk to one individual is really reduced by the group acting together. And so this is sort of an example of cooperation that not only has to do with finding food or working together, but also in surviving, right? So cooperation isn't just about feeding, but it's also about helping the rest of the group survive. Here's actually sort of a picture of two white-faced capuchin monkeys doing what is known as the overlord display. And so you can see the anaconda kind of down in the bottom left corner. It's a very, very large snake, trying to appear sort of, the capuchins are trying to appear bigger than they are by doing this sort of overlord display and mobbing the predator, hoping to sort of deter the predator from trying to attack it. I will say, I look at this though, and I go, I am way more of a coward than those monkeys because I would not be screaming at that large of a snake, that's for sure. All right, so across this unit, we've seen that predator-prey interactions are one of the strongest forces driving animal behavior and their adaptations. Every animal faces the same fundamental challenge. How do you avoid being eaten? But they solve it in sort of remarkably different ways, right? Some disappear into the background, some stay silent, some will run for their lives, and others actually stand their ground and they fight back. What unites all of these strategies, though, is trade-offs, just like we talked about in the last unit on foraging, right? Camouflage might protect you from predators, but it might be harder for you to find mates. Running might save you now, but it might cost you energy that you could be using to do other things later. And even chemical defenses or group mobbing come with its own set of risks. And so, of course, the predators aren't going to be still in this game. They've evolved sharper senses, better tactics, faster reflexes to sort of have this arms race against the prey items. But basically, it sort of results in this runaway selection where predator and prey are often making these decisions where they balance trade-offs, costs, and benefits in order to decide how to act in any given situation. And so the story of anti-predator behavior isn't just about fear or being startled. It's about adaptation, decision-making, and honestly, resilience. And so in the end, success in nature isn't about being invincible. It's about just being good enough to survive today so that you can try again tomorrow.